1981 marks the end of a very important era in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. And tonight, we're going to celebrate that era by talking about 5 of the greatest hard rock albums you'll ever hear. Find out all about those albums and this bygone era next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. Tonight, we're going to say goodbye to a bygone era in the hard rock heavy metal world. I guess you could say it's the 1970s hard rock era is starting to come to an end, which might be a little bit confusing because you're saying, well, wait a minute, 70s hard rock, didn't it end in the 70s? Of course not. There is always a little bit of a carryover. Some of the biggest bands of the 70s are still going strong into the early 80s. But it seems like in 1982, we've just about exhausted that run. And so we're going to have a quick celebration of some of the biggest bands from the 70s. And we're also going to talk about 5 particular albums in 1981 that are all-time classics. So let's not waste any time. Let's get right to it. We're going to talk about 12 bands that kind of signify the end of the 70s hard rock movement. There were a lot of contributing factors to the end of the great 70s hard rock run. And unfortunately, one of those factors was tragedy. And the first 2 bands we're going to talk about had very tragic ends. The first, Led Zeppelin. Arguably the greatest hard rock band of all time, Led Zeppelin's run came to an end in 1980 with the passing of their drummer, John Bonham. Now, I would argue that Led Zeppelin may be the greatest rock band of all time. Many people would say and have declared that to be the Beatles. But I would like to make a counter argument to that. I got into music in late 70s, early 80s. Really about a decade after the height of the Beatles. And nobody was listening to the Beatles. Conversely, Led Zeppelin ends in 1980, and yet, even into the 2000s, there was the radio stations here in Denver, for instance, would play like an hour of Led Zeppelin music called Get the Lead Out. I think Led Zeppelin's had such staying power that even to this day, well over 40 years since they hung up the guitars, they are still wildly popular. Led Zeppelin, greater than the Beatles? Maybe a hot take, but I do believe that. The other band that we want to talk about might seem a little bit out of place on this channel, but if you've been watching us from the beginning, you'll know my affection for Southern rock. And Lynyrd Skynyrd, who tragically had a horrible plane crash in 1977, killing most of the band, including lead singer Ronnie Van Zant. Southern rock, we talked about this a little bit on the channel because you can't look at hard rock music in the 70s and not acknowledge the tie-in between Southern rock and that 70s hard rock and even heavy metal. Many heavy metal bands toured with Southern rock bands, and the reason is pretty simple. Southern rock, much like our hard rock heavy metal category, was based on great instruments, great guitar solos, heavy songs. And so when Lynyrd Skynyrd passes in 1977, there's still a few bands that keep the mantle up. And honestly, 3 of the heaviest. Molly Hatchet, if you've never heard Molly Hatchet, a very good band, a very heavy band, one of the heavier Southern rock bands, a band we're going to be talking about just in a little bit, Blackfoot, which was formed by founder Rick Medlock, who had been part of the Lynyrd Skynyrd family. He's put out, Blackfoot is probably, in my humble opinion, the heaviest Southern hard rock band of all time, and ZZ Top. Unfortunately, as we hit 1981, Molly Hatchet's gone through a series of personnel changes. ZZ Top is, while wildly popular, has gone in a much more commercial direction than their Southern rock roots. And Blackfoot, well, we're going to talk about them here in a second, probably is about at the end of their run as well. So with Lynyrd Skynyrd's passing, the Southern rock movement kind of starts to fade off, and again, by the early 80s, is pretty much non-existent. So both these bands, Lynyrd Skynyrd and Led Zeppelin, their contribution to this ends in tragedy. Now, while two bands pretty much had their careers ended based on tragedy, the next band we're going to talk about is a band that went about recovering and overcoming that tragedy to keep going. That band is AC/DC. If you remember, again, back in 1980, they have a huge hit with Back in Black, and really have a string of albums from the late 70s through 1980 that are hugely successful. But once again, tragedy. Bon Scott passes away in 1980. He's replaced by Brian Johnson. And many people will say, now, wait a minute, Metal Dude. Back in Black was Brian Johnson, not Bon Scott. Well, contrary, if you go back a couple of episodes, you'll hear my theory on the fact that I think Bon Scott wrote most of Back in Black, if not all of it. So moving forward into 1981, you start to see the true Brian Johnson era begin in AC/DC. And it doesn't go particularly well in the beginning. They put out an album For Those About to Rock, which I personally love that album, but it's not quite the commercial success they had hoped. Back in Black sold 25 million copies. For Those About to Rock, 4 million copies. Now, most bands would give their eye teeth for an album that sells 4 million, but coming off a much bigger album like Back in Black, a little bit of a disappointment. And, not to put too fine a point on it, this is kind of their last commercial success, because their next couple of albums, Flick of the Switch and Fly on the Wall, really bomb. So this is kind of the end of the big AC/DC run. Now, don't worry too much. Brian Johnson's going to get his sea legs under him, and AC/DC is going to come back and have a big comeback in the late 80s and early 90s. But for now, this era is starting to come to an end. Now, I like quite a bit on this album. I love the title track, For Those About to Rock. It was nominated for Best Hard Rock Song of the Year, but they also have really good songs like COD, Night of the Long Knives, Inject the Venom. That's another really good one. So that it's just different. Brian Johnson's lyrics are not the bawdy, naughty Bon Scott style, much more of a straightforward rock and roll. And again, the fans who are used to the Bon Scott style kind of give it a lukewarm response. Still a very good album, and I would say this album right here, For Those About to Rock, really does mark the end of that AC/DC run. Again, the next couple of albums they're going to put out are not going to be well received. We'll talk more about AC/DC's big comeback when we get to the late 80s and early 90s, but for now, the last of the great AC/DC albums right here, everybody, For Those About to Rock. Okay, enough about tragedies. The other thing that really can bring a band to a complete halt, though, and it happens all the time, breakups, especially between, say, the lead singer and the lead guitarist, and that's exactly what happened with Aerosmith. Joe Perry and Steven Tyler, the Toxic Twins, had had enough of each other. And again, one of the things that you see a lot also in this era of music, the drugs are flowing. Right? There is a lot of problems because the bands are they're snorting cocaine like it's going out of style. And Steven Tyler and Joe Perry decide that they cannot work together any longer. So Joe Perry goes off and creates the Joe Perry Project, which wasn't bad. And Steven Tyler continues the Aerosmith band. They put out an album, Rock in a Hard Place, which wasn't bad. But it wasn't Aerosmith, right? It wasn't the stuff that we had been given in the 70s. It wasn't nearly of that quality. Now, don't worry. Much like AC/DC, Aerosmith is going to make a big comeback in the late 80s, early 90s. Some could even argue that the second run of Aerosmith is going to dwarf the first run of Aerosmith. But again, at this point in 1981, Aerosmith breaks up and continues that end of an era theme here, where some of the biggest bands of the 70s are starting to fade out of the picture. I do not necessarily count this band in that realm, but a slight footnote in this category. Pink Floyd's also about to go the way of the dodo, as Roger Waters, of course, leaves. And one of the shocking things, whenever a band breaks up, especially a big band like Pink Floyd, you just always assume, well, Roger Waters will be back. Not yet. Pink Floyd's gone on to do some things a little bit later as well. Roger Waters has, of course, had a long solo career, but nothing has touched what Pink Floyd was back in the 70s and early 80s. So another footnote, not necessarily that they're in the hard rock, heavy metal category, but I thought I'd throw them in here in the breakups too, because these are big bands that are kind of disbanding at this point. Right, we've talked about tragedy, we've talked about breakups, but sometimes a band just runs out of steam. And this is going to happen for the next three bands we're going to discuss. The first of those, Nazareth, one of my favorite bands of all time. Many people might even consider them a one-album wonder, because I won't argue the fact that Hair of the Dog stands clear above the rest of their catalog by a mile. That one great album probably put them in this stratosphere to begin with. And then as the albums begin to trickle on after that, they kind of start to lose their momentum. And by this point, they're starting to really drop listeners. They're bleeding fans left and right. I think really the last really good Nazareth album was Full Circle. But yeah, they 70s hard rock royalty right here, Nazareth. Their commercial success is about to come to an end. Along with another band, Blue Oyster Cult, who I'd argue is kind of the antithesis of Nazareth in that, in my humble opinion, Blue Oyster Cult never had that great album, that defining album. Maybe Agents of Fortune is that for you, but I never really found them to have that opus. What they did have, however, was some of the most catchy songs in the history of hard rock and heavy metal. We're talking Don't Fear the Reaper. We're talking about Burning for You, Godzilla. So they had some of the biggest hits in the entire hard rock spectrum right here. But once again, they're putting out an album in 1982, Fire of Unknown Origin. It's kind of the last really album where they had much commercial success. Blue Oyster Cult and Nazareth, still together to this day, still putting out music, but this is kind of the end of their commercial run. And one more band I put in here, Queen. I don't have much to say about this other than, what the hell happened to Queen? Queen was one of the most innovative, progressive, pretty cool rock bands of the 70s. They had already started to slip from kind of the heavy stuff from their early days, like Sheer Heart Attack. They'd kind of moved in a commercial direction, but then they just turned into hot garbage. Anything in the 80s that Queen did was just awful. So they kind of, I think, because their early stuff kind of had a renaissance, if you will. Queen, they just put a movie out about it. Bohemian Rhapsody, I think, is the name of the movie. If you go back in the early days of Queen, you're like, wow, what a great band. What happened? Stink Bomb City. Queen got really cringy. So, again, three bands that were kind of 70s hard rock royalty. As we get into the early 80s, they've kind of had their run, and they're just not putting out the kind of music that they did, just a few years earlier. All right, you can't really have an opinion show without having some controversial opinions, and I think this section might be a little bit controversial. But there are 4 bands that, to me, put out some of the greatest music in the history of hard rock, most of which was in the 70s and early 80s, that after 1981 kind of jumped the shark. But here's where they're a little bit different. They're going to achieve the commercial success that they were seeking, but at the expense of really the quality of their music, in my opinion. The first example of that is Rainbow, Ritchie Blackmore's crew. I know what you're thinking. Okay, Mr. Ronnie James Dio fan here talking, but I really do believe that if you look at the first 3 albums of Rainbow, when you look at Rainbow Rising, Long Live Rock and Roll, you know, you're talking about some of the best music in the 70s. Ritchie Blackmore's guitar playing alone is, every guitar player should study the way he puts together his music. Just brilliant stuff. Then they move to Graham Bonnet. They do Down to Earth. Again, not the quality of the first 3, but a very good, heavy album. Already you can see the commercialism sneaking in. And then comes the Joe Lynn Turner era. And I like the Joe Lynn Turner era. They've got some really good songs. We'll probably nominate a couple of their songs here and there. But boy. And Ritchie Blackmore, who kind of tossed the first 2 singers out the porthole because he's looking for that commercial success, is going to find it here in a very short time with Straight Between the Eyes. Probably, I'm pretty sure, their biggest selling album of all time. But just wasn't as good as the early years of Rainbow, in my humble opinion. The next band we're going to talk about is going to be a little controversial as well, Van Halen. I will put the first 4 Van Halen albums up about against anybody. Their first album, maybe I would consider to be in the category of, you could arguably say, the best hard rock heavy metal album of the 70s. That's how good Van Halen 1 is. Van Halen 2 is a step back from Van Halen 1, but there's just no way you could ever recreate Van Halen 1. And then we have 2 albums here that are of the heavier Van Halen variety, but also very good. Women and Children First, we talked about that in 1980. And we'll talk about this album, Fair Warning, spoiler alert, in a little bit. But after this, I'm not sure what happens. Because after this, we get Diver Down. Not my cup of tea whatsoever. I cannot tell you how disappointed I was in Diver Down. A lot of people love the Roy Orbison Pretty Woman cover. Happy Trails, Big Bad Bill. There's a couple of songs that are okay on this album, but for the most part, it seems like they're trying to be cheeky and clever instead of just hard rocking and going for it. Don't care for Diver Down. Now, they're going to have a huge hit on their hands just a few years after that. 1984, people are going to say, wait a minute, metal dude, 1984 was great. Panama's fantastic. Hot for Teachers, fantastic. But I can never forgive Eddie Van Halen for the keyboards in Jump. Just awful stuff. In an era where there was some great keyboardists, Van Halen is the most brilliant guitarist you're ever going to run into. Innovated the way we play guitar to this day. But his keyboard playing wasn't anything special. Dun, 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 dun. Come on. What are you doing? So I could never forgive him. And of course, Jump was their big single. This was their big hit. This is how they broke huge. Was that off that song? Couldn't stand it. Still can't stand it to this day. So, the first 4 albums of Van Halen, enthusiastic thumbs up. One of the best 4-run streaks in hard rock heavy metal history. Then the next 2 are bad to mediocre. And then don't even get me started on Van Hagar. Not my favorite era of Van Halen by a long shot. Our third band, Def Leppard. Now, if you've been a loyal viewer to this channel, you know after this album, High and Dry, me and Def Leppard are going to part company. I am going to talk a little bit about High and Dry a little bit later, another spoiler alert, as one of the greatest hard rock albums of all time, because I think this is why I have this channel. If someone was to say, I want to know about Def Leppard, and they went out to, say, Spotify and took a look, what you're going to see is their biggest albums by far have got to be Pyromania and Hysteria. I would say that the best thing I can say about those two albums is they're mediocre. At times, they're cringy bad. I don't care for either of those albums. Once again, after High and Dry, I went racing out to get Pyromania. I was so excited. Just, man, is it mediocre. Man, does it just not have any pizzazz. We'll talk about High and Dry here in a minute. But if you're one of those people who let me see what's going on with Def Leppard, and you went to those two albums and you went, ooh, what's the big deal about this band? This isn't any good at all. We're going to talk about High and Dry. Go check out the first two albums that they put out, in particular High and Dry. I think you'll find one of the greatest hard rock albums of all time kind of hidden under these colossal commercial successes that aren't very musically appealing to me. So there you go. There's three bands that absolutely are going to have great commercial success that you would say, well, it's not the end of an era. They're just getting going, but couldn't stand a thing they did after 1981. All right, we're going to wrap this baby up. It's like being at a funeral. I'm just trashing all these poor bands as they, come out of the 80s. And so I'm going to save my favorites for last. Two of my absolute favorite bands of all time. Two of the bands that, if you can imagine me 40 years ago, were my gateway bands into the world of hard rock and heavy metal. So I'm eternally grateful to both of these bands. They really were the start of a now 50-year march of wonderment here into this music. The first of those, you probably know by now, loyal member of the Kiss Army right here. I loved Kiss. However, I think it's safe to say, we've talked about this on previous episodes, that after the album Love Gun, man, did Kiss go the way of the dodo. And I think it was greed. Well, and we talked about this, and drugs. Doesn't help, but they sit, and they had just put out three great albums: Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun. They want to do another live album. They didn't even have enough really good material to put out a double live album, but they do it anyway. Okay, fine, that's fine. They had done a live album after the first three. It's a little soon for another double live album, but okay. Right after that, they put out Double Platinum, which was like a greatest hits album. It's like, well, wait a minute. Your live albums are kind of your greatest hits album. Now you're expecting your fans to pocket another double live album. Listen, double live albums were expensive, and now you put together back-to-back albums that didn't have really much new material. Then you make us go and say, we're going to put 4 solo albums out. Again, at least 2 of them complete ass, not good at all. Ace Frehley's was really the only one that was really good. And, I always had a soft spot for Gene Simmons, so I'll give his a pass as well. Then, after you've milked your fans for 2 double live albums and 4 solo albums, you come back, you completely change your sound to like a disco thing with Dynasty, which was an improvement, believe it or not. That's how bad things were. They actually had a couple of good songs on that album. And then Unmasked and The Elder. Terrible. And then Ace Frehley's going to leave the band. And really, after Ace Frehley leaves the band, I don't find anything in their catalog. I am not a fan at all of the unmasked era of Kiss. The one exception I will make to that, right towards the end of their run before they kind of got back together for their big reunion, Revenge has actually got some pretty good material on it, but the rest of it I find not not my cup of tea, but even cringy. Don't like it at all. So, yeah, Kiss went from my darlings, my favorites, to a band I didn't care for at all. Um, the other band I really loved, Ted Nugent, Sweaty Teddy, the Nuge. Like I said, if you go back and look at my record collection from 50 years ago, man, all you're going to see is Kiss and Ted Nugent. These were my two first bands that I loved. Ted Nugent, I would say, goes on a run from his first solo album all the way through Scream Dream. That's legendary. Love the first album. Love Free For All. Love Cat Scratch Fever, Weekend Warriors. And of course, Scream Dream, I think, is his last really great album. Now, after that, there's, some mediocre stuff. Intensities in 10 Cities, I was still on board, but, the production's not really good. The song quality is not that good. There's a couple of good ones in there. I stayed on for another album, Nugent, with his all-black cover. Very serious-looking Ted Nugent. I think some of the things that were happening in the 80s were that people were trying to heavy up their sound because they saw the success of the new wave of British heavy metal. I think this is Ted Nugent, kind of like the adult version of Ted Nugent. No more loincloths for me, people. I'm going to get a more sophisticated look, but it's not very good. He has a couple of good albums or good songs here and there afterwards. Off, I think, Penetrator and Little Miss Dangerous. There's a couple of pretty good things in there, but overall, my run with Ted Nugent ends pretty much right here. And I didn't get into Damn Yankees. A lot of people really did. Very popular band, but just wasn't my cup of tea. So I will be the first to admit that my tastes were changing as well from what I was listening to in the 70s. I'm starting to listen to heavier and heavier music. And so Kiss and Ted Nugent start to become not even that they're keeping up with that heavier taste of mine, but they're also, even their older stuff starts to become less and less something I'm listening to just because I'm into, heavier music. So I will say in the case of Kiss and Ted Nugent, some of that could be my taste, personal taste changing, but I do believe that the general public kind of sides with me on this one. I think Ted Nugent and Kiss pretty much have hit their peak and are coming down the other side. So they will always be close to my heart, though. Kiss and Ted Nugent, I would say, or if you said, what were your first two hard rock heavy metal bands that won your heart? Right there. Kiss, Ted Nugent. No matter how bad things got in the 80s, they were still my bands. So anyway, that's the end of an era, folks. Those are 12 bands that we just went through that had great runs that kind of came to an end right around this era. But that seems like such a downer of a topic. So let's switch gears and talk about the absolute 5 best hard rock albums of 1981. And I think you'll find that these albums are some of the best albums of all time. I kind of hinted at a few of these when we were talking about the end of an era. One of the bands I kind of hinted at shows up right here. Our first nominee for Best Hard Rock Album of 1981, Blackfoot, with the album Marauder. Now, if you go all the way back into the early 70s, I did an episode where we talked about Southern rock. We talked in particular about ZZ Top and Lynyrd Skynyrd and how closely related they were to hard rock. But as hard rock music became more and more heavy, hard rock became less and less tied to and kind of became their own category. So one of the things I kind of did was I took them out of the realm a little bit. We'll do special Southern rock episodes later. They kind of are their own music now. But one exception I'm going to make is right here, because this album is heavy. If you have heard a lot about Southern hard rock, but never really gave it a try because it's like, well, I don't know where to start. Skynyrd is definitely absolutely legendary. Start with Freebird, work your way up, but don't sleep on Blackfoot. Rick Medlock, of course, originally was part of that Lynyrd Skynyrd band, and he takes that music and even makes it heavier. This album, Good Morning, Rattlesnake Rock and Roller, Diary of a Working Man, Dry County, there is hit after hit after hit, and they're all got lots of grit, lots of attitude, and lots of heaviness. Our first nominee, Blackfoot, Marauder. True Confession. In 1981, this band, maybe they weren't my absolute favorite. There's a few others in there, but they were amongst my absolute favorite bands. Def Leppard with their album High and Dry. I love the first two Def Leppard albums. This one is an all-timer. This is a perfect album. My highest compliment I can give an album is to say it's perfect. Every song on this thing is an absolute gem. The reason I love this album so much, it still has the heaviness and the rawness and the guitars of the very first one. But you can see now the songwriting's improving, the production's improving. They're just more consistent throughout the album. If you hated Hysteria, if you didn't care for Pyromania, please do yourself a favor. Go back one more and listen to High and Dry. I think it is probably one of the most underrated albums of all time because it's not going to have the sales numbers that those other two had, but it is so much better than those other two albums. This is absolutely, and it's not even close, the best Def Leppard album. They have the big hits, right? You probably heard Let It Go, Bringing on the Heartbreak, the title track. But it's got some really good deep tracks too, like Mirror, Mirror and Lady Strange. And go check this out. Our second nominee, High and Dry by Def Leppard. The theme of this episode is really about bands that have kind of had their run. They're either peaking or have peaked. Their best is behind them. The exception to that is our third nominee, Motley Crue, with the album Too Fast for Love. Motley Crue, they're just starting off. And I will say that if you go back a couple of episodes, we talk about how this end of the 70s rock is kind of going to be replaced by the California scene, the glam metal movement that Motley Crue is starting here. So one of the things we celebrate is the birth of the glam metal movement. It starts right here with Motley Crue. So everything that ends has a new beginning. Most of the great hard rock that's going to come out over the next decade is going to come out of that glam metal California scene, starting right here. And this is a absolute gem, very raw, very cool. I've talked about the great song Livewire, but this thing again is chock full of really good Motley Crue hits. Our third nominee, Motley Crue, Too Fast for Love. Our fourth nominee is one of the biggest bands in the history of the hard rock heavy metal movement, Rush, with the album that many people consider their absolute best, their opus, Moving Pictures. Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart. Three of the best musicians that have graced the hard rock heavy metal stage. There is some really good instrumental music happening on this album. We talked about YYZ a couple of albums back. Many people consider that to be their most epic instrumental. We talked a little bit about Tom Sawyer. Probably their biggest hit. Very good. Another big hit off this, Limelight. This thing is just chock full. Again, many people say, if you want to see Rush at the heights of their powers, go right here to Moving Pictures. Our fourth nominee, Rush, Moving Pictures. Our fifth and final nominee is another band that we hinted about earlier, Van Halen, Fair Warning. This is, again, the last of the great Van Halen albums. It is also the last of the really heavy Van Halen albums. Again, we talked about the Twins, Women and Children First, Fair Warning being kind of the darker, heavier era of Van Halen. Mean Streets is just dark attitude, almost gloomy for Van Halen. But on the flip side of that, they have the song Unchained, one of my all-time favorites, which is just rowdy, and what a great party song. This is a really good era of Van Halen. They're really doing some cool things. I would say the one thing I really love about this album is, Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest guitarists of all time, he shines throughout. Even in the bad Van Halen albums, Eddie Van Halen shines. But this album really, I think, epitomizes them as a band more. And by that, I mean Alex has a great contributions on this. And I will go out on a limb and say, if you want to say, what is the best Michael Anthony album, is right here. Michael Anthony, very underrated bass player. He brings it on this album. Again, a lot of the Van Halen albums, you're going to say, "Ooh, Eddie Van Halen," and you don't really notice the rest of the band. I think if you want to look at Van Halen, not just Eddie, not just with David Lee Roth, but the entirety of the band, I would look right here for our fifth and final nominee, Van Halen, Fair Warning. And the winner is You Got No Respect. Respect for Authority. One of my favorite albums of all time. These are all great, but this was an easy one. Def Leppard, High and Dry. Oh, the fateful things you say in life. I remember talking to my friend. We were debating what the greatest albums were, and I said, listen, Def Leppard is going to be the biggest band. They're going to be the AC/DC in the next decade. Unfortunately, I was correct. Def Leppard became huge, but not the way I wanted them to be. They kind of sold out a little bit. And it's kind of funny because if you go all the way back to the controversies surrounding them in their very first album, they had that song Coming to America, and the British fans were already starting to get a little suspicious. Like, what are you up to? Kissing ass on the Americans already, What, are you going to sell out? Yep, they sure did. I never saw more people wearing Union Jack shorts in my life. Anyway, I didn't care for them after this, but this album I absolutely adore. It's one of my favorites. I've never gotten tired of it. I put it in the hard rock category, even though they're in the new wave of British heavy metal, because I just think when you start to look over time, it feels more like a hard rock album, but this thing is heavy as hell. So this is, if you want to put in the heavy metal camp, I have no problems with that. Man, I shout out to Pete Willis because they throw him out of the band, and the band's just never the same after that. So I'm going to give him all the credit for these early first two albums because, man, we talk a lot about great guitar players. We talk about Eddie Van Halen. We talk about Ritchie Blackmore, all that. But sometimes you don't have to be a great guitar player, but you have great tone. You have great presence with your guitars. The guitar tone on these first two albums, man, it just really stands out. The production of these things is excellent, really has a sophisticated feel, but yet keeps that raw edge. I don't know how to describe it. Sometimes you get a raw, edging album, but it's because the production isn't quite where it needs to be. It's really a magic trick when you can have a raw sounding album that's also produced beautifully. That's what this is right here. So congratulations to Def Leppard, Hard Rock Album of the Year for 1981. And that's our episode. this is the time where I make my sales pitch. Ring the bell, subscribe, get all of our content. We do this every Tuesday. And let me give you a little sneak peek. We have just finished talking about hard rock. But starting next week, we're going to talk about the best heavy metal songs of the year and the best heavy metal albums of the year. And boy, there are some big contenders. You don't want to miss it. Really stacked field this year. So in the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. As always, take care.